To the west of Leningrad, where the Gulf of Finland froze into a bitter steel-grey sheet, the Soviets held a piece of land that had haunted the Germans since 1941. They called it the Oranienbaum Pocket. We called it a mistake we never corrected. The pocket had never fallen. Kronstadt's naval guns still guarded the harbour, and the Red Army used it like a dagger pointed at our lines, launching attacks through the flat, waterlogged expanse of Ingermanland, forests, swamps, and endless mud. It had been quiet for some time. Too quiet. We all knew the storm was coming. Since the earliest days of the war, Army Group North had failed to crush Oranienbaum. By 1942, the Norwegians of the DNL had fought bitterly at Uritsk to hold the line against Soviet landings, and still the Russians clung on. They dug deep into the earth, reinforced by the strength of Kronstadt's coastal defences and shielded by the marshes that devoured tanks and froze boots solid. For over 2 years, nothing seemed to change here. Leningrad refused to fall. The Finns stayed frozen on their lines. The Soviets kept bleeding themselves against the Volkhov and Valdai, trying to break through to their starving city. We fought back with all we had, but our strength was slowly, inexorably, draining into the snow. By the winter of 1943, we were no longer the hunters. The front here had become a slow strangulation, and the Red Army had been growing in strength. We could feel it. More artillery, more patrols, more confidence. Meanwhile, our own divisions were running on fumes. Hitler and the OKW knew it, so they began pulling every man they could from the west, stripping garrisons and reserve units to reinforce the east. Among the formations sent to Leningrad was Steiner's 3rd Germanic SS Panzer Corps, our corps. I arrived with them in early December, along with thousands of foreign volunteers, old comrades, and wide-eyed replacements. The snow barely covered the wreckage of earlier years. We were placed under General Georg Lindemann's 18th Army. Our corps was to anchor the defence of the Oranienbaum sector. It sounded important, critical even. But in truth, the line was barely holding, and Steiner knew it. We had the veterans of the Nordland and Nederland divisions, but we were also saddled with 2 Luftwaffe Field Divisions, the 9th and 10th, who were not paratroopers or trained infantry, but ground crew, mechanics, radio operators, men who had never seen close combat and barely knew how to dig a foxhole. Goering, more bloated and drugged with each passing month, had insisted on keeping these Luftwaffe divisions under his control instead of folding them into proper army formations where they might be trained and led with at least a chance of survival. I remember the look on Steiner's face when he first inspected their positions, barely covered, rifles caked in frost, officers reading from manuals under candlelight. It was clear that many of them wouldn't survive the first real Soviet assault, and yet they had to hold. We needed them to soak up the blow. So Steiner did what he could. He positioned the Luftwaffe troops in the exposed eastern sector directly in the line of fire. The Nederland division was placed farther west, near the forest roads, and our Nordland division, proud and grim as ever, was held in depth along the southern edge of the salient, our corps' spine and reserve. We were to plug whatever hole the Soviets punched through, but even our strongest battalion, the Hermann von Salza Panzer unit, was still out of reach, receiving Panther tanks and conducting crash course training far from the front. Without them, our armoured punch was hollow. Steiner gritted his teeth, we all did. To our left, in the eastern coastal sector, was an odd collection of forces under the command of SS Brigadeführer Christian Peder Krissing. Once the first commander of Frikorps Danmark, he now led Kampfgruppe Küste, Battle Group Coast, a mixed force of naval, coastal, and reserve army units. It was little more than a stopgap, but surprisingly well organized. By Christmas 1943, their strength report listed over 12,500 men, 341 officers, 1,975 NCOs, 10,146 rank and file, and 106 Hiwis. That made them nearly as strong as Nordland on paper, but half of their missing men were officers and NCOs, experienced leaders we couldn't replace. I remember hearing from one of the coastal defencemen, a conscript from Bremen, how they had spent the last 3 weeks chopping frozen earth with axes just to lay down telephone lines. "We're not ready," he told me, hands cracked and blackened. "If they come here, it's a funeral, not a battle." I believed him. In the frozen trenches overlooking the Gulf of Finland, there was no glory. The sky was always grey, the air smelled of damp wood, gun oil, and old death. Our patrols came back bloodied. The Soviets were probing. They had more men, more mortars, more trucks. The sound of engines echoed across the ice at night. You'd listen to it and know, this front was about to erupt. And when it did, the Luftwaffe divisions would break. We all knew it. The question wasn't if, it was when and what it would cost us to hold the line once they fell. Just like the years before, the Soviets chose midwinter to strike. For the third time, their high command, Stavka, committed to launching a full-scale offensive in the frozen northern sector. But this time was not like the last. The Germans weren't holding fresh positions. The Luftwaffe divisions weren't the hardened men of 1941. And the Soviets weren't probing. They were coming to finish what they had started. At precisely 7 o'clock on the 14th of January, the sky above Oranienbaum split open. Thousands of Soviet artillery pieces unleashed hell across the German line. The earth didn't shake. It rolled. It buckled. Trees were shredded into matchsticks. Trenches vanished under gouts of fire and snow. We had known the storm was coming, but not like this. It was the beginning of Leningrad's liberation, and we were standing in its way. Even as the shells struck, the Soviet infantry of the Second Shock Army slammed down their vodka rations and went forward screaming their war cry, "Urrah!" They surged out from the pocket with momentum, numbers, and shock on their side. They weren't aiming to push us, they were aiming to smash through us entirely. The first wave hit the Luftwaffe divisions, who had no chance. Outnumbered more than 4-1, barely trained, and positioned in exposed forward zones, they were simply overrun. Colonel Ernst Michael's 9th Luftwaffe Division was hit from the front and rear. The Soviet 42nd Army had already broken through the neighbouring 126th Infantry Division and swung into their flank, encircling entire battalions before they could even retreat. The 10th Division fared no better. Their rear lines collapsed under weight of fire and confusion. What had been a static front turned into a flood. Steiner had no choice. He threw the Nordland into the maelstrom. Battalion after battalion rushed forward like a fire brigade to patch the holes. For a week, von Scholz's division was everywhere. We had no rear, no rotation, no pause. Every day our units were redeployed to counter some new Soviet breakthrough at Malkunova, at Begunizi, at Kosherizi. Entire companies were wiped out in single engagements. Fritz Buntz's assault engineers, the SS Pioneer Battalion 11, lost 100 men in one day near Malkunova. Some were vaporized in shell fire, others vanished under tank treads. And still we held. No rest, no replacements, only orders. Hold the line, whatever is left of it. One of the Norwegians, John Sandstad, was with the 1st Battalion of the Norge Regiment when the offensive began. His voice, later recorded in letters and testimony, gave us a soldier's truth. On the day the major Soviet attack began, our company had 118 men. 7 Reichsdeutsche NCOs, 34 Volksdeutsche, 1 Flemish Unterscharführer, and 76 Norwegians. 2 officers, 15 NCOs, 59 men. They didn't last. On the night of January 15th, Soviet infantry began probing their lines. The next morning, the counterattack collapsed almost instantly under blistering crossfire. Sandstad's company lost 13 dead, many more wounded. The 2nd and 3rd companies suffered the same. In 10 days of unrelenting pressure, all 3 companies were reduced to the strength of 1. His brother Olav, a fellow Norwegian who had enlisted the same year, was killed 5 days in near Kosherizi. Buried near Begunizi, alongside so many others, his grave would soon be abandoned. The divisional cemetery would be overrun by spring. On January 27th, after almost 2 weeks of non-stop combat, Sandstad's company was reduced to just 35 men and 5 NCOs under a single Obersturmführer. Their battalion commander, Fritz Vogt, came to hand out iron crosses, not for bravery, not for victory, just for surviving. And it still wasn't enough. Army Group North was collapsing. After holding this line for over 2 years, through siege, starvation, and fire, we were forced to pull back. The 16th and 18th Armies fell southwest toward the so-called Panther Line, an illusion of strength along the Luga River. It was little more than a name on a map. As we pulled back through the ruined trenches and shell-churned forests, a silence fell behind us, a long, heavy silence. Then, from the north, came a different sound, 1,000 bells ringing across Leningrad. The city was free. The longest siege in the history of warfare, nearly 900 days, was finally broken. But there was no celebration for us. The Nordland was still in action. The Luftwaffe's 9th Division and remnants of the 126th Infantry were cut off near Ropsha. Steiner ordered a breakout. We lunged forward with what we had left: SS assault units, armoured cars, gun carriers. The line cracked, and we pulled the trapped men out. It was our last offensive act in the sector. After that, it was retreat. Without the heavy panthers of the Hermann von Salza battalion, Nordland's most powerful armoured force was now Saalbach's Aufklärungsabteilung, our recon battalion. Lighter vehicles, volunteers, veterans, Volksdeutsche and Swedes. It was these men who covered our withdrawal, holding Gubiansi while we retreated toward Jamberg, also known as Kingisepp. The fighting was savage. The Schwedenzug, Nilsson's Swedish platoon, was nearly wiped out in rearguard actions at Volosovo and Orlovo. Then, on the night of January 26th, Soviet tanks attacked in force, but Saalbach's men were ready. They let them come. In a few short hours, 34 Soviet tanks burned in the snow, one of the best nights we'd had all winter. Caspar Spork, a young Dutch volunteer, earned distinction leading a troop of half-tracks fitted with 75mm anti-tank guns. He held until his barrels glowed. Another soldier, Tony Ging, remembered those days clearly. I was a driver, trained on SPWs. Mine had a 2-centimeter turret. The commander was a Rottenführer. The gunner was a Swede. I forget their names now. We were sent to Rekia village near Volosovo. There were no enemies at first, and the other SPW returned. But just as we turned around, infantry fire erupted from the houses. I hit something under the snow, stone or wreckage, and the vehicle was stuck. We had to bail. First the commander, then the Swede, then me. We ran for the other SPW, but the Swede was hit before we reached it. We dragged him in, but he didn't survive. By the time we reached Jamberg, we had crossed the Luga. But the Soviets had already reached the river farther north and south. What was supposed to be a new line was already compromised. The Luga was useless. The retreat had to continue, back toward the old Estonian border, toward the Narva line. The last to cross were the men of the Norge Regiment's 1st Battalion, many of them Norwegian volunteers. They held the eastern bank alone, while the rest of Army Group North streamed west. When they finally fell back, they left nothing behind but frozen corpses and burning wreckage. It was the end of the Oranienbaum front and the beginning of the next nightmare. By early February, after weeks of punishing retreat through mud, blood and ice, we finally outran them. The Soviet juggernaut slowed just enough for us to reach the river Narva before they did. What remained of the Nordland crossed the bridges in staggered columns, half frozen, caked in soot and smoke, and missing too many familiar faces. Steiner and von Scholz wasted no time. The Narva would be our new line, or it would be our grave. The men of the Nordland were thrown directly into forming a hasty defence along the river banks. Narva itself was on the west bank. The ancient city of Ivangorod lay opposite, on the east bank, its fortress walls rising like ghosts through the mist. The Norge regiment crossed west and was deployed in the marshes southwest of the city, frozen swampland where feet broke through ice into mud and machine gun nests vanished into cattails. Denmark and Nederland remained east of the river. They would form the bridgehead, our forward shield. But we hadn't gained much time. The Red Army was only days behind. Within 72 hours, they struck south of the city and tried to swing around us, an envelopment attempt from the rear. It was the Norge, as always, that took the full weight of the blow. Fighting waist-deep in waterlogged trenches and under constant artillery, they managed to halt the advance, just barely. They pinned the Soviets into 2 bridgehead pockets on the west side of the river. We called them the Ostsack and the Westsack, Eastern Sack, Western Sack. The Soviets were trapped between us and the water, but we couldn't push them back across. During the chaos, we lost men we couldn't afford to lose. Arnold Stoffers, the highly decorated and deeply respected commander of the Norge regiment, was killed while personally leading an assault near the river. Two of the regiment's 3 battalion commanders went down with him. Hans Heinrich Lohmann, gravely wounded, and Albrecht Krugel transferred over to take command of Denmark, after Graf Hermenegild von Westphalen was killed in action. The officer corps had been shredded. The line held, but only just. As things stabilized, the battered corps was restructured. Steiner's 3rd SS Panzer Corps and Krissing's coastal group were folded into a new formation, Armeegruppe Narva, under the command of General Anton Grasser, a Knight's Cross recipient and veteran of the Eastern Front. Krissing's men were quickly tested. On the night of February 13th, Soviet Marines attempted an amphibious landing near the town of Meriquela. They came in low, fast and loud, stormboats churning up the black water, automatic fire echoing in the reeds. But Krissing's coastal troops, backed by Nordland reinforcements, met them at the shore. What followed was brutal, close-quarters fighting, bayonets, grenades and submachine guns lighting up the beach in flashes. By dawn, the shoreline was littered with Soviet dead. The landing had been repulsed. Then came a moment of hope. Reinforcements. In late February, the newly formed 20th Waffen Grenadier Division der SS, Estnische No. 1, arrived on the line. These weren't raw conscripts. The Estonians came from Schuma battalions, the Narwa battalion of Wiking, and the Waffen SS Estonian Legion. Many were veterans of anti-partisan warfare. They were local. They knew the land, and most of all, they had something to fight for. This was their country now under siege. They were tough, nationalistic, and ruthless. No political illusions. Just men who knew that retreat meant Soviet rule and retribution. But even as the Soviet offensive slowed, the fighting never truly stopped. The Red Army could now rest entire divisions and still attack with fresh forces. Using the Ostsack and Westsack as launching points, the Soviet 8th Army began a new effort to cut the Narva-Reval road and trap us on the eastern side of the river. March became a month of grinding attrition. One day pushing forward, the next pulled back. Neither side could claim a decisive victory. It was trench warfare again, soaked in artillery, mud, and loss. One Soviet attack in early March nearly succeeded in cutting us off from the south, threatening to wedge itself between Nordland and the 11th Infantry Division, an old Wehrmacht unit still holding the flank. In response, the two formations launched not one, but 3 separate counterattacks, working together with Schwer Panzerabteilung 502, the heavy tank battalion outfitted with Tiger tanks. Those machines, 30 tons of iron and fire, became our battering rams. They rolled forward over wreckage and burning logs, their 88mm guns shattering bunkers and turning enemy tanks into twisted shells. On March 30th, after days of close-quarters horror, the Westsack was finally crushed. Soviet survivors were either driven into the river or killed in place. For his actions that day, Norwegian SS Untersturmführer Kåre Brunstad was awarded the Iron Cross First Class, having led his men under withering fire to seize a key bunker complex. His section had taken the position using only grenades and bayonets. But while the Westsack had fallen, the Ostsack remained. The Soviets held on, despite counterattacks, bombardments, and every attempt to collapse it. Their troops dug in deeper, reinforcing the bridgehead with supplies and fresh men. Every time we tried to storm it, we were thrown back with losses. The land became a moonscape, scorched birch trees, shattered trenches, and a stench of rot that no snow could bury. One Nordland grenadier wrote in his diary, "We fight on a patch of earth no bigger than a village square. We have taken it, lost it, taken it again. It smells of smoke and entrails. We sleep on corpses and frozen mud. They won't let go, neither will we." This was no longer a battle for ground. It was a battle for delay, for time for Army Group North to reorganize, time for new units to arrive, time for the war to change course. Though by now, many of us had stopped believing that part. We were not winning, but we were holding, and for the moment that was enough. By mid-December 1943, the Eastern Front had receded westward like a tide in retreat. Only a short salient near the town of Korsun still clung to the eastern banks of the mighty Dnieper River. Here, the Wehrmacht held a tenuous grip, its last foothold beyond the river line, centered on a crumbling Ukrainian landscape, once torn open during the heady, brutal advance of Operation Barbarossa. It was bitterly ironic for the men of the Viking Division. Just 2.5 years earlier, they had thundered through this very region on their way east, full of ambition and fire, part of the great Germanic crusade against Bolshevism. Back then, Viking was the most powerful formation in the Waffen-SS. Its ranks swelled with Scandinavian and Western European volunteers. Now it returned battered and diminished, holding the line not out of conquest but out of desperation. The Viking Division of December 1943 was no longer the same force that had stormed the Bug and the Dnieper. It had been reorganized into one of the 30 fully fledged Panzer divisions within the Wehrmacht's structure, and its once celebrated international character had thinned. Many of its Dutch, Danish and Norwegian volunteers had been siphoned off the previous year to fill the ranks of the newly formed Nordland and Nederland divisions. In their place came native Germans, replacing foreign accents with Saxon and Bavarian tones. Yet even now, over 1,000 foreign fighters remained, hard veterans who had stayed through every season, through the frost of 1941 and the fire of Kharkov. Among them were several hundred Scandinavians, still clinging to their identity, still fighting under the black sun of Viking. The division's commander, SS Brigade Führer Herbert Otto Giller, was a different kind of leader. Tall, silver-haired, bespectacled, he looked more like a professor than a soldier. But he had proven himself again and again, first as the division's artillery chief, now as its commander. Decorated, respected, and utterly calm under fire, Giller had earned his men's loyalty through action rather than bluster. Some army officers whispered doubts about his grand strategy, but no one questioned his courage. When things went wrong, Giller didn't scream. He showed up at the front in his staff car, often too close to the shelling, watching, noting, commanding. The division was reinforced on paper with the newly attached 5th SS Volunteer Assault Brigade, Wallonian, led by former Belgian army officer Lucien Lippert. Lippert's Walloons were tough, aggressive and politically zealous, eager to prove themselves worthy allies of the Reich. Alongside them, other SS volunteer brigades had been formed in 1943, the French brigade Frankreich, attached to the Horst Wessel division, and the Flemish Langemark, which now operated with Das Reich, but Viking, Wallonian and Nederland would carry the heaviest burden in the months ahead. At Stavka, headquarters in Moscow, the Soviet command had adopted a new doctrine: permanent pressure. There would be no respite for the fascists, no lulls, no time to rest, shift reserves or dig deeper. The Soviets would attack along every front, all at once, with shock, fire and mass. With every month, they were becoming a modern army, mechanized, armored and politically unyielding. Hitler, clinging to the fantasy of a counter-offensive from the Dnieper line, refused to allow a general withdrawal. His fixation gave the Soviets a perfect opportunity. If they could break through here, they might trap entire German corps against the river, a second Stalingrad. On paper, Army Group South looked formidable. General Hans Valentin Huber's 1st Panzer Army and Otto Wöhler's 8th Army fielded several corps. Soviet intelligence predicted that over 100,000 German troops might be encircled, but Soviet estimates, for once, overshot the truth. The formations they observed were corps in name only. Starved of supplies, stripped of manpower, and haunted by frostbite and exhaustion, they were ghost armies. Colonel Schmidt of the 57th Infantry Division wrote a blunt report during this period. The battalions are barely at 30% strength. Morale is broken. The men no longer believe. We lack food, boots, winter gear. What we have is bitterness and a cold indifference toward orders from above. Only one formation still had real fighting capability, the Viking Division. Now part of the 11th Corps, it numbered roughly 14,000 men, but even that figure concealed the truth. Hans Mühlenkamp, Viking's armoured commander and one of its last charismatic leaders, was absent, away reforming a 2nd Panzer battalion. That left Hans Köhler to command what was left, just 25 Panzer IVs, 12 obsolete Panzer IIIs, and 6 Stugee 3 assault guns. It was a Panzer division in name only, yet it was still elite. still fast, still dangerous. If any unit could break out, it was Wiking. The Red Army's next move came fast. On Christmas Eve 1943, as bells rang in ruined chapels across Ukraine, the 1st, 2nd, 3rd and 4th Ukrainian fronts began a colossal offensive. From Ovruch in the north to Zaporozhye in the south, more than 2.3 million Red Army soldiers went forward. Over 29,000 artillery pieces screamed across the front, unleashing hell. Soviet aircraft blackened the sky. 2,000 tanks rolled in waves. A tide of steel and fire slammed into Army Group South's overstretched lines, held by just 1.76 million men. Within 72 hours, the German front had buckled. Soviet spearheads carved deep into the rear areas, bypassing trenches and strong points. By the new year, they were behind Wiking. One Panzer grenadier recalled in a letter to his wife, "The earth shook for 3 days. I couldn't hear anything. When the shelling stopped, we saw them, rows and rows of T-34s, just appear to fight its way out." By 28 January 1944, the iron trap snapped shut. At the village of Zvenigorodka, beside the frozen banks of the Gniloy Tikich River, 2 Soviet armoured juggernauts, the 6th Tank Army and 5th Guards Tank Army, met in a handshake of steel. The encirclement was complete. The German Wiking Division, alongside their Belgian Walloon comrades, and a patchwork of Wehrmacht infantry divisions, now found themselves surrounded, forming the bulk of what would become known as Gruppe Stemmermann, named after General of Artillery Wilhelm Stemmermann, the highest-ranking officer trapped within the Kessel. Marshal Konev and General Vatutin wasted no time. With chilling efficiency, the Soviets established 2 concentric rings. The outer line would face any breakout attempts from the encircled force. The inner line would face any breakout attempts from the encircled force. Inner line was tasked with preventing even a whisper of escape. Inside the shrinking cauldron, chaos reigned. Soviet artillery bombarded the German positions relentlessly, hammering the already frozen ground back and forth in a storm of high explosive. Just as at Stalingrad a year prior, Hitler refused permission for a breakout. Instead, he ordered the defenders to hold and wait for relief. It was a delusion. The enemy was at the gates, and the Dnieper behind them was no longer salvation. It was a wall. On the 1st of February, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein launched a desperate 2-pronged relief attack. He threw in 5 Panzer divisions. Nearly all the Army Group South had left, including the Leibstandarte and elements of Das Reich. Just 2 years earlier, such a force would have caused Soviet lines to disintegrate. But the Red Army was no longer the same. Now it could meet steel with steel, responding with 6 full tank corps, 1 mechanized corps, and 4 rifle corps. After just a week of bitter fighting in the slush and blood of the Ukrainian plains, the relief attack ground to a halt. The trapped men inside the pocket were now on their own. For the Walloon volunteers of the 5th SS Assault Brigade, the battle inside the Kessel was unlike anything they had faced. SS Standartennober-Junker Raymond Lemaire, who had just returned from specialist pioneer training in Dresden, was flung straight into the inferno. We pioneers had to man the infantry positions just to plug gaps. By the end, I was the last NCO left in my platoon. The Soviets came again on the 30th of January. It was hand-to-hand, 2 hours of nothing but knives, rifle butts and screaming. We beat them back, but I caught grenade fragments in both legs. I couldn't walk. They put me on a Ju-52 and flew me out. I was lucky. Lemaire was one of the few. Of the 2,000 Walloons that entered the pocket, only 632 would live to walk out again. And the toll on Viking's Scandinavian veterans was no less severe. Concentrated mostly in the Germania Regiment's grenadier companies, the Norwegians, Danes and Swedes held the line in snow-blind conditions, their frozen breath thick with smoke and desperation. Many died in their trenches, their rifles still clutched in frost-bitten fingers. One Danish volunteer wrote in his diary, "I haven't taken my boots off in 5 days. The lice are in my beard now. The Soviets come at night and shout in broken German, 'Surrender, you pigs!' We answer with bullets. Every day we lose more. There is no warmth, no end. The weather was merciless. The open Ukrainian steppe became a wind-blasted nightmare. Blizzards swept through the ravines and thickets, pushing the thermometer to -20 degrees Celsius. Shelter became a matter of life and death. But the Red Air Force worked tirelessly to flatten every building that might offer it. Soviet bombers treated every barn, every hut, every farmhouse as a fortress. One Walloon wrote, "They wanted us to sleep on the snow. The moment we found a shack, it disappeared under fire." But the Luftwaffe would not abandon them. Junkers Ju-52 transports, nicknamed Tante Ju by the troops, these aging aircraft flew 868 tons of munitions and nearly 83,000 gallons of fuel into the cauldron. They evacuated more than 4,100 wounded men, but the cost was devastating. Dozens of Ju-52s were shot down, often in flames. Belgian SS officer Léon de Grelle would later write, "Every day our anti-justs fell from the sky, burning. The screams of the wounded inside, roasting alive, were etched into our minds. We could do nothing. We had no flak left. Even when the snow stopped, the nightmare continued. The brief thaws turned the roads into a death trap of glutinous, choking mud." One German tank crewman described it as lava. "The snow mixed with the black Ukrainian earth. It grabbed our tracks and wouldn't let go. Even frost wouldn't freeze it. One tank sank up to its turret. Just gone." Manstein's relief force found themselves swallowed by this slush. Panzers sank and stuck. Men froze in their foxholes or drowned in ditches. Inside the pocket, the situation was terminal. De Grelle again. "The tanks hadn't come. We had hoped, but now hope was gone. There were no more bullets. The quartermasters had no food. Men died standing up. The wounded bled out in the frost. We were suffocating. The Viking held its ground as best it could, but its lights, broken boards, anything to create cover. But the Soviets came in waves. The 27th and 52nd armies pressed in from both sides. Their artillery never stopped. By mid-February, the ground itself seemed to burn. One Norwegian in the Germania regiment wrote in a final letter, "We are living in smoke. It is always night. I have forgotten what warmth feels like. I do not think I will survive." That letter was never sent. Refusing to abandon the men trapped inside the cauldron, von Manstein rolled the dice one last time. Gathering all 8 of his remaining Panzer divisions, Leibstandarte, 1st, 3rd, 11th, 13th, 14th, 16th, and 17th Panzer, he hurled them in a desperate thrust northeast toward the village of Lysyanka. There, just beyond the broken trees and winter haze, lay the Gniloi Tikic River and its crucial bridge, the final artery through which the trapped divisions might escape. Simultaneously, deep inside the Kessel, General Stemmermann had already begun shifting the pocket southwest toward a small village now bursting at the seams with the remains of a broken army, Shandarovka. What was once a peaceful Ukrainian hamlet had turned into a hellish refugee camp of wounded soldiers, destroyed vehicles, tattered carts, and hundreds of dazed Ukrainian civilians trailing the remnants of the German war machine. Every barn was full, every cellar flooded, every road jammed with pannier carts and limping grenadiers. 1,000 men froze in place, too weak to move, too stubborn to surrender. SS Unterscharführer Schorsch Neuber of Wiking's Signals Battalion recalled, "We were being eaten alive by hunger. Days went by with no food. The last ration we received was almost laughable, a single frozen lump of rice that was meant to feed 8 men. I sucked snow for moisture, my lips split open from the cold." Yet even in this nightmare, hope flickered. After nearly 3 weeks of fighting, Manstein's tanks were finally nearing the edge of the Kessel. The sky above buzzed with the same weathered Ju-52s that had been flying in ammunition and fuel. Now some flew barely above treetop height, tossing 50-gallon drums of fuel out the side doors, barrels that landed in the snow beside the advancing Panzer spearheads to keep the engines growling. The Viking division, battered but still disciplined, was chosen to spearhead the breakout. Stemmermann had no other armoured unit left. On the 16th of February, just 5 kilometres from Salvation, he gave the final order, attack. But first, a darker command was issued, one that no commander ever wanted to speak: leave the wounded behind. Men froze as the words spread down the line. Every soldier knew what that meant. Wounded prisoners, especially SS, would not be spared. Abandoning them felt like betrayal, but obeying meant survival. Some units ignored it. In Viking, the chief medical officer, Dr. Thon defied the order entirely. He loaded more than 130 of the most seriously wounded onto sleds and carts, local Panzer wagons, and joined the retreat himself. Between them and the waiting bridge stood Hill 239, a gentle rise by most standards, but a decisive feature in a land this flat. If the hill could be held, Stemmermann's entire force might slip through under the cover of artillery. If not, they'd have to fight their way through open fire. It had already been taken in a daring attack by a small battle group under Captain Walter Scherff of the 1st Panzer Division. But there were no reserves, and his few Tigers and Grenadiers were forced to abandon the hill when Soviet infantry and artillery overwhelmed the position. Without that ground, the escape would become a slaughter. Then the order came. Password, freedom. Viking's remaining tanks and assault guns revved their engines and surged forward. The breakout had begun. In one of the bravest actions of the entire war, the armoured detachment smashed through the first Soviet lines, cut a corridor through fire and chaos, and then, instead of continuing west to safety, they turned around. The panzers of Kuller's group went back into the fire to cover the withdrawal of the others. None of the tanks would return. Léon de Grelle, witnessing the scene from the roadside, never forgot what he saw. The tankers' faces were stoic, noble, heads and shoulders out the turrets, uniforms trimmed with silver. They wore their knights' crosses like medals for the grave. The enemy would spot them easily, but still they turned back toward the inferno, their treads tearing through the snow and slush past our retreating men. Then came the stampede. Close to 45,000 army and SS men surged toward Lysyanka. The columns were a mass of wagons, limping wounded, scattered infantry, carts of dying horses, and a few armoured vehicles still intact. But the Soviets weren't about to let them slip away. Entire Red Army formations, infantry, artillery, cavalry, tanks, rushed into the kill zone. What followed, in the words of both German and Soviet eyewitnesses, was nothing short of annihilation. In less than 24 hours, tens of thousands of men were cut down in an area no larger than a few square kilometers. Soviet T-34s rolled directly into the retreating masses. Ambulances, carts of wounded, even medical columns were crushed beneath their tracks. Horse-drawn wagons exploded in a shower of fire and limbs. De Grelle again. They came over the rise like phantoms. Soviet tanks drove straight into the convoy. They crushed the carts one by one like matchboxes. I saw wounded men flattened. There was screaming, always screaming. For a moment the tanks became stuck in the mass and we had seconds to breathe, but then they pushed forward again. The 5th Guards Cavalry Corps joined the horror. Red sabres flashed in the sun as thousands of Soviet horsemen galloped through the fog of war, hacking down anything that moved. No quarter was given. One Soviet officer, Major Kampov of Konyev's staff, would later write, "It was madness. Hundreds and hundreds of cavalry rode into them like ghosts. There was no time for surrender, no time to take prisoners. I had seen Stalingrad, but never anything like this. Men were cleaved open as they ran. Dr. Thon's convoy of Viking wounded was among those cut to pieces. Of the 130 he had tried to save, fewer than a dozen survived. Some made it to the bridge at Lysyanka, but most did not. The survivors found themselves staring at the Gniloy Tikich River, a fast-moving, ice-choked torrent 8 meters wide with no bridge in sight. The Soviets had taken it. Panic swept through the survivors. Among them was SS Gruppenführer Herbert Gieler, leading over 4,000 Viking grenadiers and Wehrmacht stragglers. They were soaked, freezing, exhausted, but Gieler remained calm. Dressed in his fur coat, walking stick in hand, he ordered an armoured vehicle driven into the river to form a breakwater. It was swept away by the current. Still undeterred, he organised human chains, men linking arms, hauling each other forward, and even used the remaining horses as makeshift ferries. The water was black and deadly, but under Gieler's command, the crossings began. Shouting over the roar of the current, he moved up and down the riverbank, dragging men into the freezing water himself. Somehow, against all odds, the bulk of Viking survivors made it across. They left behind their wounded, their dead, their friends, but they lived. As dawn broke over the ruined Ukrainian countryside, thousands of frost-bitten men staggered across the western bank of the Niloi Tikich. They had survived. They had crawled out of the cauldron, and now, in the ruins of Lysyanka, they were met by the outstretched hands and silent stares of their comrades from the 1st Panzer Division and the elite Leibstandarte. These were not grand reunions. There were no shouts of victory or embraces of joy, just the quiet acknowledgement of men who had seen the face of death and walked past it. But there would be no rest, no warm meal, no bed or fire. The bridgehead was too shallow, too weak. The Soviet tide was pressing even here, and the relief columns could not linger. The survivors, still soaked to the bone and encrusted in filth and frost, were sent marching farther west, back into the mud, into the cold, their uniforms now frozen stiff against the bones of their emaciated frames. For many, the exhaustion was worse than the pain. They had believed the nightmare was over, and now they were being told to keep moving. One officer from Wiking's reconnaissance battalion later wrote, "The silence was the loudest thing I remember. We trudged west in total quiet. Nobody spoke. The wounded groaned, the carts creaked, the snow crunched. I looked at the men beside me, grey faces, ice on their brows, hollow cheeks. I didn't recognize my own comrades. And yet, in the pit of despair, there was survival. Of the approximately 56,000 men trapped in the pocket when the noose closed, just over 40,000 made it out. Some by air, flown out in Ju-52s under heavy fire, but most on foot, fighting every step of the way. They had been abandoned by fate, cursed by weather, and hunted like animals, and still they had emerged, but not all of them. The commander of Group Stemmermann, General Wilhelm Stemmermann himself, had not survived the final breakout. As his columns surged toward the river, Stemmermann had taken position in a Wiking staff car, desperate to maintain contact and visibility with his scattered formations. SS Rottenführer Klenner, his driver, accelerated through the churned mud of a frozen road when a Soviet anti-tank round struck the car. It tore through the frame and exploded inside. Shrapnel lacerated Stemmermann's body, killing him instantly. Klenner too was likely killed on impact. Soviet troops would later find the vehicle, its twisted metal barely recognizable. They removed the body, laid it in the snow, and examined the man who had held the German line for nearly 3 weeks under impossible conditions. One Red Army report described him simply as a little old man with grey hair. A monocle still hung from his neck. His death marked the end of the German stand at Cherkasy. The man who had tried to hold the pocket together, who had fought Hitler's orders in silence, who had watched thousands of men die under his command, was now just another frozen corpse on the Ukrainian steppe. But his men had lived. Against every odd, tens of thousands had broken out. They had crossed rivers of ice, fought through rings of steel, and faced the wrath of Soviet tanks and sabres with nothing but grit and desperation. For the survivors of the Viking, the Wallonian, the Leibstandarte, and countless Wehrmacht infantry divisions, Cherkasy was not just a battle, it was a graveyard of illusions. The Eastern Front had bled them again. The Reich would remember the wandering pocket of February 1944 as both a miracle of escape and a warning of worse to come. And for those who made it out, many would return to the lines, to Narva, to Warsaw, to Budapest, to Berlin. But they would never forget the cold, the hunger, the endless marches, and the mountain of dead left behind in the snow.